Cynthia stood blocking my path, arms crossed, that practiced smile plastered across her face like armor. "That contraption," she said, gesturing dismissively at my wheelchair.
It's an illegal motorized vehicle. You can't just drive around here whenever you please. There are rules, standards, and frankly, it's becoming a problem.
Let me take you back. Back to before that moment, before the police calls, before everything exploded into a legal battle that would change not just my life, but the entire neighborhood. Because this story isn't just about a wheelchair, it's about belonging, about dignity, about what happens when someone decides you don't deserve basic human respect simply because your body works differently than theirs.
My name is Elena Rodriguez. I'm 34 years old. I have a neuromuscular condition called limb-girdle muscular dystrophy.
That's the medical term. What it means in practice is that my muscles progressively weaken, making walking impossible, and most daily activities a careful negotiation between what I want to do and what my body will allow. I use a standard electric wheelchair, not a fancy one, not some high-tech marvel, just a reliable mobility device that lets me live independently. It's my legs, my freedom, my connection to the world beyond my front door. And Cynthia Bell wanted to take it away from me. Welcome to my story. It's going to take some time to tell properly, so settle in. Every detail matters, every interaction built toward what came next, and I promise you, by the end, you'll understand why this wasn't just about rules, or property values, or neighborhood aesthetics. This was about my right to exist in the place I called home. I moved to Willow Creek Estates 3 years before all of this started. It's a planned community, you know the type. Identical mailboxes, approved paint colors, lawns maintained to exact specifications. The kind of place where conformity gets disguised as community standards. But it was perfect for me. Single-story ranch home, wide doorways, accessible bathroom, and most importantly, smooth, well-maintained sidewalks that made navigating in my wheelchair effortless. I could roll to the community park, to the small shopping center 2 blocks away, to my neighbor's house for coffee. Independence. That's what those sidewalks represented. Freedom from constant dependence on others, from ride-sharing apps, from the exhausting logistics that define disabled life in inaccessible spaces. The first 2 years were genuinely peaceful. My neighbors were friendly in that polite suburban way. Waves across lawns, brief conversations at the mailbox, invitations to block parties. I worked remotely as a software developer, contributed to the community, paid my HOA fees on time, maintained my property to standards. I was, by every objective measure, a model resident. But I had committed an unforgivable sin in Cynthia Bell's eyes. I was visibly disabled. And visibility, I would learn, was the problem. Cynthia had been on the HOA board for 7 years, vice president technically, but everyone knew she ran things. Margaret Chen was the official president, but Margaret was quiet, conflict-averse, more interested in organizing the annual holiday decorating contest than in actual governance. Cynthia, though, Cynthia thrived on control. She was 53, impeccably dressed, always clutching that infamous clipboard. Every violation got noted. Every deviation from standards got documented. She patrolled the neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom, and in many ways, it was. I first noticed her attention about 6 months before things escalated. Small things, initially. She'd stare when I rolled past. Not just looking, staring, with this expression I couldn't quite read. Curiosity, concern, something darker. Then came the questions. Casual, at first, delivered with that smile that never reached her eyes. Do you live here alone? How do you manage? Must be expensive, all that equipment. Do you work, or... The unfinished sentences were the worst. They hung in the air, heavy with implication. Do you work, or are you living off disability payments, off the system, off taxpayers like me? I answered politely, deflecting, trying to maintain neighborly relations, but I felt the judgment, the assessment, the way she looked at my wheelchair like it was a blight on her perfect street. The passive aggression graduated to active aggression on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was heading out for my daily roll. Exercise, fresh air, the mental health necessity of leaving my house. Spring had finally arrived, and the weather was perfect. I'd made it 2 blocks when Cynthia's car pulled up beside me. She rolled down her window, that smile firmly in place. "Elena, can I have a word?" I stopped, wary but still trying to be civil. "Sure, Cynthia, what's up?" She put her car in park and got out, clipboard naturally in hand. "I wanted to talk to you about your mobility device." My stomach dropped. I knew that tone, the false sweetness coating something toxic. "My wheelchair?" "Yes, there have been some concerns from residents about safety." "Safety concerns about my wheelchair?" "Well, it is motorized equipment, and the sidewalks are designated pedestrian paths. We need to think about liability. What if you accidentally hit someone? What if a child runs out?" I kept my voice level, professional. "Cynthia, I've been using this wheelchair here for 3 years. I've never hit anyone. I go slower than most people walk. Electric wheelchairs are legally classified as pedestrian mobility devices, not vehicles." Her smile tightened. "Regardless, the board is considering implementing some restrictions, time limits perhaps, designated routes. We're just trying to be proactive." Restrictions on when and where I can use my wheelchair? That can't be legal. The HOA has broad authority to regulate use of common areas for the safety and comfort of all residents. She said it like she'd rehearsed it, which she probably had. "I'm not trying to be difficult, Elena. I'm just following the rules. Rules that apply to everyone equally." Equally. That word. As if restricting my mobility device affected everyone the same way. As if taking away my access to sidewalks was the same as asking someone to paint their fence a different color. "I'd like to see the specific bylaw you're referring to," I said carefully. Her expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "I'll have Margaret send you the relevant sections. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you'd limit your outdoor activities to off-peak hours, early morning or evening, when there's less foot traffic." And there it was, the real request. Stay invisible, exist only when normal people aren't around to be uncomfortable with your presence. "I'm not going to restrict my life to avoid being seen, Cynthia." "I'm not asking you to restrict your life. I'm asking you to be considerate of others. And I'm telling you that asking a disabled person to only exist during certain hours isn't consideration. It's discrimination." The smile vanished, just dropped away, revealing something cold and hard beneath. "That's a very serious accusation, Elena. I suggest you think carefully before throwing around words like that. This community has standards. If you're unwilling to meet those standards, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." She got back in her car and drove away. Before I could respond, left me there on the sidewalk, shaking with anger and something worse, fear. Because she'd said the quiet part out loud. "Perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." She wanted me gone. I tried to let it go, told myself Cynthia was just one person, that the board would see reason, that this was posturing rather than actual policy. I requested copies of the HOA bylaws, read through all 37 pages, and found exactly 0 restrictions on mobility devices. Nothing about motorized equipment, nothing about time restrictions, nothing that would support anything Cynthia had claimed. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt more anxious. Because if the rules didn't exist, but Cynthia was acting like they did, what was she really planning? I found out the following week. It was Thursday afternoon, around 2 p.m. Perfect weather again, sunny but not hot. I was rolling toward the park, planning to sit by the pond for a while, enjoy the sunshine, maybe read for a bit. I was 1 block from home when I heard the sirens. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Sirens aren't that uncommon. Medical emergencies, minor accidents, false alarms. But then, the police cruiser pulled onto my street. Then another, then a third. And they were coming toward me. My heart started racing. Had something happened? Was there an emergency? Should I get out of the way? The first cruiser stopped directly in front of me. An officer stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt, expression professional but wary. "Ma'am, I need you to stop and show me some identification." I stopped, confused and increasingly frightened. "Of course. Can you tell me what this is about?" "We received a call about a vehicle operating illegally on the sidewalk, terrorizing the pedestrians." The world tilted. "I'm sorry, what? Are you the owner of this—" He glanced at my wheelchair, clearly uncertain. "Motorized vehicle?" "This is a wheelchair, my wheelchair. It's not a vehicle, it's a mobility device." A second officer approached, older, more experienced. He looked at me, looked at the wheelchair, and his expression shifted from wary to annoyed. But not at me. "Jenkins, that's an electric wheelchair, not a motor vehicle." The first officer, Jenkins, looked embarrassed. The caller said, "I don't care what the caller said. An electric wheelchair is legally classified as a pedestrian mobility device. It belongs on sidewalks. This is where she's supposed to be." I found my voice finally. "Who called you?" The senior officer, his name tag read Morrison, consulted his notes. Cynthia Bell. She's listed as HOA vice president. She claims someone was driving a motorized vehicle recklessly on pedestrian sidewalks, endangering residents, refusing to stop when confronted. That's completely false. I've done nothing wrong. I'm just going to the park. Morrison looked at me with something like sympathy. "Look, we have to respond to calls, but this is clearly not what was reported. You're free to go. I apologize for the inconvenience." But Jenkins was radioing something, and another voice crackled through. Cynthia's voice. "Officers, has she been arrested yet? I'm around the corner. I want to make a formal statement about the ongoing nuisance." Morrison's jaw tightened. He responded coolly. "Ma'am, no arrest has been made because no crime has been committed. An electric wheelchair is a legal mobility aid, not a motor vehicle. The individual has every right to use the sidewalk." Cynthia appeared then, walking quickly, clipboard clutched like a weapon. She looked at me, then at the officers, face flushing with anger when she realized I wasn't in handcuffs. "Why hasn't she been cited? I specifically reported illegal use of motorized equipment." Morrison cut her off, voice hardening. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a crime. Making frivolous emergency calls wastes resources and could result in charges against you. This woman is using a legal mobility aid exactly as intended. There is no violation." "But the HOA has rules." "The HOA does not supersede state and federal law regarding disability accommodations. If you continue to harass this resident, she would be well in her rights to pursue legal action against you personally and the HOA collectively." The satisfaction I felt watching Cynthia's face turn red to white was intense. But it was mixed with terror because I saw in her eyes that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Morrison turned to me. "Ma'am, if she continues to harass you or makes false reports, document everything and contact us. You may also want to consult with a lawyer about your rights under disability law." Cynthia was standing there, speechless for once, as the officers got back in their cruisers and left. Then she found her voice. "You think you've won something here? You've just made things much worse for yourself. The board will be hearing about this. And we have authority to fine you, to restrict access to common areas, to make your life here very uncomfortable if you insist on being difficult." "I'm not being difficult. I'm existing. That's all I've done. Your existence is disruptive. You draw attention, you make people uncomfortable, and whether you want to accept it or not, that affects property values. It affects the character of this neighborhood. She walked away, leaving me shaking on the sidewalk, sun beating down, perfect spring day, suddenly feeling cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene. The police car, Cynthia's face, the casual cruelty of her final words. Your existence is disruptive. I'd spent my whole life dealing with ableism in various forms. Inaccessible buildings, condescending strangers, medical professionals who talked over me to family members as if my disability affected my intelligence. Job discrimination disguised as concerns about fit. But this was different. This was someone actively trying to erase me from my own neighborhood, someone with institutional power, willing to weaponize police, willing to lie, willing to make my daily life unbearable until I gave up and moved away. And I realized something. Running away would solve nothing. There would always be another Cynthia, another place where my visibility was treated as an inconvenience, another system designed for bodies like mine to stay invisible, stay home, stay quiet. I was done staying quiet. The next morning, I started researching. Not just HOA bylaws, but disability law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, legal precedents involving HOAs and discrimination. What I found was illuminating. HOAs, despite their broad authority over property aesthetics and community standards, are explicitly bound by federal disability law. They cannot restrict access based on disability. They cannot impose rules that discriminate against disabled residents. They cannot retaliate against residents for requesting reasonable accommodations. And everything Cynthia had done, the threats, the police call, the intimidation, was textbook discrimination and retaliation. But I needed more than just knowledge. I needed a strategy. And then I found it. The HOA elections were coming up in 3 months. Board positions were elected by residents. I could run. I could get on that board. I could have a voice in decisions that affected my life. It was perfect. Democratic, legitimate, using the system's own rules against it. I drafted my candidacy statement that same day, kept it professional, focused on transparency, accountability, and ensuring the HOA served all residents fairly. I didn't mention Cynthia or the harassment directly. I didn't have to. Anyone who'd been paying attention knew exactly what I was responding to. I submitted my candidacy paperwork to Margaret Chen, the HOA president, 2 weeks later, met all requirements, resident for over a year, dues paid in full, statement submitted on time. Margaret accepted my paperwork with a nervous smile. "This should be fine," she said, though her eyes kept darting away. "We'll include your name on the ballot." "Thank you, Margaret. I'm looking forward to a fair election." She nodded, but something in her expression made my stomach twist. Fear. She was afraid. Of me? No. Of Cynthia. 2 weeks before the election, official notices went out to all residents. The ballot listed all candidates for the 3 open board positions. My name wasn't on it. I stared at the paper, certain there was a mistake. I'd submitted everything correctly. Margaret had confirmed receipt. But there, printed officially, were 5 names, and mine wasn't one of them. I called Margaret immediately. She answered on the 4th ring, voice small. "Elena, my name isn't on the ballot." Silence. Then, there were some concerns raised about your eligibility." "What concerns? I meet every requirement." "The board felt there were questions about whether you could fulfill the responsibilities, given your situation." Given my situation. Given my disability. The words she wouldn't say hung between us. "Elena, that's discrimination. You can't exclude someone from running for office because they're disabled." I'm not. Her voice cracked. "Elena, I'm sorry. I tried, but Cynthia insisted. She said you were creating division, that your candidacy was disruptive, that residents were concerned. She threatened to... She stopped. Threatened to what? I can't. I'm sorry, I can't help you. She hung up. I sat there, ballot in hand, rage and helplessness warring in my chest. They'd simply erased me, removed my name like I didn't exist, like I had no right to participate in decisions about my own community. This wasn't just discrimination anymore. This was silencing. This was being told explicitly and officially that I didn't belong. But they'd made a mistake, because in trying to shut me out completely, they'd given me something more powerful than a board seat. Grounds for a lawsuit that could dismantle their discriminatory system entirely. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Patricia Wu, and she specialized in disability discrimination cases. I explained everything: the harassment, the police call, the candidacy exclusion. There was a long pause when I finished. Then Patricia spoke, voice sharp and satisfied. They violated the Fair Housing Act multiple times, and by excluding you from the election based on disability, they've created a clear paper trail of discriminatory intent. Alina, you have an exceptionally strong case. We can sue the HOA for discrimination, retaliation, and civil rights violations. And we should include Cynthia Bell personally for harassment and abuse of power. Will we win? Not just win. We'll establish precedent. This is the kind of case that changes policy, that makes HOAs think twice before pulling this kind of stunt again. We filed the lawsuit 1 week before the election, named the HOA collectively and Cynthia Bell individually, demanded immediate injunction to add my name to the ballot, plus damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages for willful discrimination. The neighborhood exploded. The lawsuit hit like a bomb. Within 24 hours, everyone in Willow Creek Estates knew. Some neighbors approached me with support, sharing their own stories of Cynthia's overreach. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with conflict, or perhaps agreeing with Cynthia's tactics, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. But the most interesting reaction came from the other board members. Margaret Chen showed up at my door 2 days after we filed. She looked terrible. Pale, exhausted, guilt written across every feature. Elena, I need to tell you something before this goes to court. I invited her in, wary but curious. She sat in my living room, hands twisting in her lap. Cynthia threatened me before you submitted your candidacy. She said if I let your name go forward, she'd start auditing my property for violations. She'd make my life hell. She's done it before to people who disagreed with her. Dave Martinez refused to vote her way on parking regulations 3 years ago, and suddenly he had violations every week, fines piling up. He eventually moved rather than deal with it. So you let her remove my name to protect yourself. Shame flooded her face. I'm not proud of it, but yes, and I'm not the only one. Tom Bradshaw and Jennifer Lee were both on the review committee. They both knew your candidacy was legitimate, but Cynthia convinced them, threatened them, into agreeing you were unqualified. Do you have any of this in writing? Emails? Texts? She hesitated, then nodded. Some. Enough to show the board discussed removing you specifically, with explicit mention of your disability as a concern. Will you testify to that, officially? Another pause, then quietly, yes, I will. This has gone too far. I should have stood up to her years ago. Patricia Wu was delighted when I forwarded Margaret's confession and the email chains. This is everything we need. They documented their own discrimination. Juries love evidence like this. Clear, unambiguous, self-incriminating. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The judge would decide whether to grant the emergency injunction to add my name to the ballot, and whether the case had enough merit to proceed to trial. Cynthia hired a lawyer. expensive, according to neighborhood gossip, someone who specialized in HOA defense and property law. But even the best lawyers struggle when their clients have documented proof of discrimination. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Our side presented the timeline: Cynthia's harassment, the false police report, the exclusion from the ballot, and the smoking gun emails discussing my disability as grounds for disqualification. Cynthia's lawyer tried several defenses. First, that the HOA had legitimate concerns about my ability to fulfill duties. Patricia destroyed that by pointing out I'd never been asked about accommodations, that board meetings were already accessible, and questioning someone's competence based purely on physical disability violated federal law. Second, they claimed the election process was discretionary, allowing the board to evaluate candidates' suitability. Patricia countered that discretion doesn't permit discrimination, and excluding someone explicitly because of disability status was textbook ADA violation. Third, they tried to argue I was being overly sensitive and weaponizing civil rights law for personal gain. This backfired spectacularly when the judge cut off the lawyer mid-sentence. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that a resident pointing out actual discrimination is weaponizing civil rights law? Because that's not a defense. That's an admission." The judge ruled from the bench. Injunction granted. My name would be added to the ballot immediately. Election would be postponed by 2 weeks to allow for proper notice. Furthermore, the case would proceed to full trial on the discrimination and retaliation claims. And then he did something unexpected. He looked directly at Cynthia. "Ms. Bell, I want to be extremely clear. Your actions, as documented in this record, show a pattern of harassment, abuse of authority, and willful discrimination. If I were you, I would settle this case quickly and quietly, because if it goes to trial, you will lose, and you will face personal liability that could be financially devastating. This isn't a property dispute. This is a federal civil rights case. Do you understand the difference?" Cynthia sat frozen, face white, finally comprehending that she couldn't bully or manipulate her way out of this. The election was postponed. My name appeared on the revised ballot, and the neighborhood had to confront what had been happening in plain sight for years. Support for me grew, but not universally. Some residents genuinely believed the HOA should have discretion to exclude candidates. Others felt uncomfortable with the lawsuit, preferring handling things internally, despite the fact that internal handling had failed spectacularly. But many, more than I expected, came forward with their own stories. Disabilities, both visible and invisible, chronic illnesses that flared unpredictably, mental health conditions that required accommodations. All people who'd stayed quiet, afraid of becoming Cynthia's next target. One woman, Sarah Mitchell, told me she had rheumatoid arthritis and sometimes needed a mobility scooter. She'd been too afraid to use it in the neighborhood because of Cynthia's comments about maintaining aesthetics. She'd been essentially homebound on her bad days rather than risk harassment. Another neighbor, James Chen, no relation to Margaret, had a son with autism. The boy stimmed, repetitive movements that helped him self-regulate, and Cynthia had complained multiple times that it was disturbing and inappropriate for public spaces. James had started avoiding common areas with his son. Story after story, pattern after pattern. Cynthia had created an environment where anyone who deviated from her narrow definition of normal learned to hide, to minimize, to stay invisible. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't really about me anymore. Or rather, it was about me, but also about everyone else Cynthia had silenced. This lawsuit was a chance to establish that HOAs can't create disability-free zones, can't enforce invisibility, can't pretend that only certain bodies belong in shared spaces. Patricia and I discussed strategy. Patricia's lawyer had reached out about settlement. They were scared, trying to avoid trial, but I wanted to be careful. A settlement that only addressed my specific grievances wouldn't protect the next disabled person or the person after that. We need policy changes, I told Patricia, written into the settlement, mandatory training for board members on disability law, accessible meeting formats, a formal complaint process with third-party review, and personal consequences for Cynthia. Patricia smiled grimly. Let's make them an offer they can't afford to refuse. The settlement negotiations took 3 weeks. Back and forth, offers and counter-offers, Cynthia's lawyer trying to minimize everything while Patricia held firm on comprehensive changes. Finally, we received their acceptance. The terms were extensive. Financial, $75,000 to me personally for damages and emotional distress, $50,000 in attorney's fees, $25,000 donation to a local disability rights organization in the HOA's name. Policy changes. All board members required to complete disability sensitivity and legal compliance training annually. Formal non-discrimination policy added to HOA bylaws, specifically protecting against disability discrimination. Accessible meeting formats, hybrid virtual options, materials provided in advance, communication accommodations upon request, independent oversight committee to review discrimination complaints, prohibition on using disability status in any HOA decision-making, personal consequences for Cynthia, immediate resignation from the HOA board, prohibition from running for board positions for 5 years, personal payment of $10,000 to me for harassment, written apology to be posted in community newsletter and common areas. The written apology was my favorite part. Patricia had drafted it to be specific and unambiguous. I, Cynthia Bell, apologize to Elena Rodriguez for my harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority. My actions were wrong, illegal, and caused significant harm. I unfairly targeted Ms. Rodriguez because of her disability, attempted to restrict her access to community spaces, filed a false police report, and excluded her from democratic participation in HOA governance. I acknowledge these actions violated federal disability law and basic human decency. I am deeply sorry and commit to educating myself on disability rights and accessibility. Reading it, knowing it would be posted for everyone to see, knowing Cynthia would have to sign it, it felt like vindication. The settlement was finalized 1 week before the rescheduled election. Cynthia resigned that same day, issuing a brief statement claiming she was stepping back for personal reasons, as if the lawsuit and her forced apology hadn't happened. But everyone knew. The whole neighborhood knew. With Cynthia gone and the election finally happening, I expected to run unopposed or face only token competition. What I didn't expect was what actually happened. 3 days before the election, I received a knock on my door. I opened it to find my neighbor Mark Sullivan, who lived 4 houses down. I'd waved to him occasionally, but didn't know him well. He was in a wheelchair, too. Spinal cord injury, I'd heard through neighborhood gossip, from a car accident years ago. "Elena, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course, come in." He rolled into my living room, looking nervous. "I've been following everything that happened with Cynthia, the lawsuit, the settlement, all of it, and I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "For fighting back, for not just accepting it. I've been in this neighborhood for 8 years. I've dealt with Cynthia's comments, her stares, her passive-aggressive suggestions that maybe I should consider moving somewhere more suitable. But I never pushed back because I was afraid. Afraid of making things worse, afraid of being seen as difficult, afraid of becoming a target." His voice cracked slightly. "I hated myself for that fear. And watching you refuse to accept it, watching you stand up and fight, it made me realize I've been complicit in my own erasure." I didn't know what to say. I'd been so focused on my own fight that I hadn't fully considered how it might affect others. Mark continued, I want to run for the board. I want to be part of making sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else. But I wanted to check with you first, because I don't want to seem like I'm competing against you or undermining what you've done. I felt emotion rising in my throat. Mark, you running doesn't undermine anything. It reinforces everything. It shows that disabled people belong in decision-making spaces, that we're not just asking for accommodation, we're demanding equal participation. He smiled, relief evident. So you don't mind? Mind? I'm honored. Run, win, make this place better. He did run, and the election became something unexpected. Not a battle, but a statement. 3 open board positions, and both Mark and I ran, along with several other candidates, including Sarah Mitchell, who'd decided she was done hiding her mobility scooter. The election results came in on a Tuesday evening. Community Center, votes counted publicly, results announced at 8 p.m. Mark and I both won seats. Sarah came in 4th, narrowly missing, but promising to run again. The message was clear. The neighborhood had changed. Or at least, enough of the neighborhood had changed. Serving on the HOA board wasn't glamorous. It was budget meetings and maintenance schedules and endless debates about fence heights and garage door colors. But it was also power. Real power to shape policies, to set priorities, to decide what kind of community Willow Creek Estates would be. The first order of business at our inaugural board meeting was implementing the settlement terms. We drafted the new non-discrimination policy, scheduled the mandatory training, established the oversight committee. Margaret Chen, who'd retained her president position, supported everything with an almost desperate enthusiasm, her guilt motivating real change. But the deeper work was cultural. Policies on paper matter, but shifting actual attitudes and behaviors takes sustained effort. We started small. Created a community email list for sharing accessibility information, which businesses were wheelchair accessible, which events needed accommodation improvements, where sidewalk repairs were needed. What began as a practical tool became something more, a way for disabled residents to be visible without being vulnerable. We hosted community events that prioritized inclusion from the planning stage, not as an afterthought. Movie night in the park? We ensured open captioning and wheelchair-accessible seating from the beginning. Community picnic? We made sure tables were accessible height and dietary restrictions were accommodated without making people explain their medical conditions. Small changes, but aggregated, they shifted the assumption from normal people plus accommodations for those unfortunate others to everyone belongs, everyone has needs, designed for inclusion from the start. Not everyone was happy about it. Some residents grumbled about political correctness or felt that disability issues were getting too much attention. A few moved away, preferring HOAs with more traditional, read ableist, approaches. But more people stayed, and many thanked us privately for creating a space where they felt safe being fully themselves. Not just disabled residents, but aging residents grateful for accessible design, parents with young children and strollers appreciating curb cuts, people with invisible disabilities relieved not to have to justify their existence constantly. I served 2 years on the board. Then I stepped down, not because of burnout or conflict, but because I'd accomplished what I needed to accomplish. The policies were established, the culture was shifting, other people, including Mark, were carrying the work forward. And honestly, I was tired. Fighting takes energy. Constant vigilance takes energy. Being the visible representative of disability politics in every meeting, every decision, every interaction, it's exhausting in ways that are hard to explain to people who've never had to do it. I wanted to go back to being just Elena, not wheelchair Elena, not activist Elena, not symbol of disability rights Elena, just Elena. Person who likes reading mystery novels and bad reality TV and overcomplicated coffee drinks. But here's what I learned. You don't get to be just Elena when your existence is politicized, when your body is read as statement before it's seen as person. The wheelchair makes me visible and therefore makes me responsible, whether I want that responsibility or not. It's unfair. It's exhausting. And it's reality. Cynthia, meanwhile, faded from neighborhood consciousness. I heard she moved to a different HOA community, one where her authoritarian tendencies might be better appreciated. I felt no satisfaction in her departure, no sense of victory. Mostly, I felt sad. Sad that someone had spent so much energy on hatred and control instead of just letting people exist. But I also learned that individual bad actors aren't really the problem. Cynthia was terrible, yes, but she was enabled by a system that gave her unchecked power, by neighbors who stayed silent, by structures that treated discrimination as a matter of opinion rather than violation of rights. The real victory wasn't removing Cynthia. It was changing those systems, breaking those silences, establishing new structure. 3 years later, I still live in Willow Creek Estates. The HOA is imperfect. All bureaucracies are. But it's fundamentally different than it was under Cynthia's reign. I roll through the neighborhood regularly. Sometimes I pass Sarah on her mobility scooter and we wave. Sometimes I see James Chen's son stimming happily in the park while other kids play around him, no one staring or commenting. Sometimes I notice the subtle changes. Ramps that weren't there before, benches at regular intervals for people who need to rest, accessible playground equipment. Small victories. Incremental progress. Not the dramatic transformation you see in movies, but the slow, grinding work of making space for people who've been excluded. I still get stared at sometimes, still get the occasional comment from someone who thinks their discomfort with my disability is my problem to manage. But the difference now is that I'm not alone. The community, or at least enough of the community, has decided that inclusion matters more than aesthetic perfection. Mark is still on the board. He's running for president next year, and he'll probably win. The mandatory disability training has become part of onboarding for all new board members. The Independent Oversight Committee has reviewed and resolved 3 discrimination complaints, preventing them from escalating into legal nightmares. The systems we built are working. Not perfectly, but working. I think about Cynthia sometimes. Wonder if she learned anything, if she ever understood the harm she caused, if she's replicating the same patterns in her new neighborhood. Probably. People like that rarely change because change requires admitting you were wrong, and ego rarely permits that level of honesty. But I also think about Margaret Chen, who found her spine and now chairs the Oversight Committee. About Tom Bradshaw and Jennifer Lee, the board members who went along with Cynthia's discrimination, who completed the training and, according to Margaret, genuinely engaged with it, asking questions, examining their own assumptions. People can change. Systems can change. Communities can decide to be better. Not because of one lawsuit or one election, but because enough people decided that belonging, real belonging, not conditional acceptance, mattered more than maintaining comfortable exclusion. The work continues. It always continues. There's no final victory in disability rights, no moment when you've achieved full equality and can stop fighting. Every new board member needs training. Every new resident needs to learn the culture. Every policy needs defending against erosion. But that's okay, because I'm not fighting alone anymore. And neither is the next disabled person who moves to Willow Creek Estates, or the aging resident who needs a walker, or the parent with a special needs child. We built something. Not perfect, but real. Not a solution, but a foundation. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when I roll through the neighborhood and see kids playing, neighbors chatting, accessibility features integrated so naturally they're barely noticed, Sometimes I feel something I didn't feel during those dark months when Cynthia was trying to erase me. I feel like I belong, not as a guest, not as someone tolerated despite my wheelchair, but as a full member of a community that decided, imperfectly, messily, but genuinely, that everyone deserves dignity. That's the real story. Not the dramatic lawsuit or the villain's defeat, but the slow, ordinary work of building a community where a wheelchair is just a wheelchair, where I'm just Elena, where existence isn't disruptive, where I finally, fully belong.